During Memorial Day, the son of a fallen Marine greets President Donald Trump after his speech. What he did next will give you chills. The clang of the metal gate echoed through the stillness of Arlington National Cemetery as Jacob stood in the shadows, his fingers gripping the handle of the shovel. The morning air was thick with anticipation, as if the very earth knew something important was about to happen. His gaze swept over the crowd gathering around the grandstand, the families of fallen soldiers standing side by side in quiet grief. Today was Memorial Day, and they had come to honor their loved ones. Jacob had seen the scene play out year after year, always from a distance. He was the unseen keeper of this hallowed ground, the man who maintained the final resting places of thousands of soldiers. Most of the visitors didn't know his name or the years of dedication he had poured into this place. He preferred it that way. As he moved between the rows of white headstones, his eyes were drawn to the motorcade pulling in. The black SUVs rolled to a stop, and moments later, Donald Trump stepped out, flanked by his security team. The crowd stirred, whispers rippling through the sea of murmurs. Jacob had seen plenty of politicians over the years, but today something felt different. Trump made his way toward the families, shaking hands and offering quiet words. Jacob watched from a distance, expecting the usual pomp and spectacle, but then something caught his attention. Trump wasn't rushing, he wasn't grandstanding. Instead, he knelt down beside a 6-year-old boy, clutching a folded American flag. The child's mother stood behind him, tears streaking her face, but the boy's eyes were fixed on Trump. He had been told that the president would be around, and he knew he was supposed to greet him like the big boy he was, but the words simply wouldn't come out. He expected the president to frown or scoff at him for not being able to utter a meager hello. Instead, Trump smiled at him and shook his hand, calling him brave and telling him to stay strong for his mummy's sake. From where he was standing, Jacob couldn't hear what was being said, but he saw the president reach out and gently touch the boy's shoulder. The child nodded, tears brimming in his eyes. Despite the pomp, Jacob noticed something different about the president today. Trump walked slower, his usual brashness tempered by the weight of the occasion. He moved from family to family, shaking hands and listening to their stories. The moment was quiet, intimate, and deeply human. For the first time, Jacob felt a pang of doubt about the assumptions he'd made over the years. He had always viewed politicians as users of symbols like these soldiers' tools for their gain. But watching Trump, Jacob saw something else: humility. Maybe I was wrong, he whispered to himself. His mind drifted to why he had taken this job in the first place. Hidden from the world, Jacob hadn't always been a groundskeeper. Once he had been a Marine like the men buried around him, wearing the same uniform, standing shoulder to shoulder with men he'd called brothers. He had known the camaraderie of the battlefield, the unspoken bond that formed in the heat of combat, where trust wasn't just earned, it was essential for survival. But all of that had changed in an instant. An eyed explosion, just another deadly surprise on a dusty Afghan road, had ripped through their convoy. The blast had been deafening, the world around him swallowed by chaos, heat and fire. When the smoke cleared, Jacob was the only one left breathing. He never understood why he survived, while his squad mates, the men who had trusted him with their lives, didn't. It wasn't just grief that followed him home, it was a searing, unbearable guilt that clung to him as though every breath he took was a betrayal to those who could no longer breathe. His wife had tried to understand at first, asking soft, patient questions, but Jacob had no answers. Why was he the one who made it out? What right did he have to a normal life when his brothers in arms were buried in flag-draped coffins? Eventually, the weight of his silence drove a wedge between them. His nightmares became too frequent, his withdrawal too deep. His wife's eyes would search his face for the man she once knew, but all she found was a hollow version of the husband and father who had left for war. His child, a boy of 5, had stopped asking when Dad would play with him again. The distance Jacob created grew like a chasm until one day it was too wide to cross. Unable to cope, he left. He walked away from the life he no longer felt he deserved, from the family he believed would be better off without him. The guilt gnawed at him like a disease, an invisible wound that never healed, no matter how many miles he put between himself and the memories of Afghanistan. He sought refuge in the one place where the dead outnumbered the living Arlington National Cemetery. There, surrounded by the graves of men who had died in service, he found the only peace he could, working among those who had paid the ultimate price, like he should have. But even in the quiet of the cemetery, the guilt never fully left. It stayed with him, lingering like a shadow, always reminding him that he was a survivor in a place meant for the fallen. But now, as he watched Trump with the families, something inside him began to stir, something he had buried long ago. He hadn't realized how bitter he had become over the years. Watching the president, Jacob started to question whether he had allowed his grief to turn into resentment. As Trump finished his rounds and stepped up to the podium to speak, Jacob moved a little closer. He could hear Trump addressing the crowd, his voice steady, recounting stories of sacrifice and speaking of the importance of honoring those who had given their lives for their country. But it was what he did next that truly caught Jacob off guard. After his speech, Trump made his way back down to the families, but instead of leaving, as Jacob expected, he turned to the small boy again, kneeling down to the child's level. He whispered something in his ear. The boy's mother was moved by such a display of affection and respect towards them. It wasn't every day that the President of the United States himself stopped to offer his condolences, and at that moment she felt overwhelmed by gratitude. Jacob too felt something crack open inside him. He hadn't expected this from the man. Trump, the larger-than-life figure who seemed to carry the world on his shoulders, was kneeling beside a grieving boy, offering words of comfort in a way Jacob had never imagined. The scene pierced through his hardened exterior, slipping past the walls he had built to keep himself numb. For years he had convinced himself that people like Trump didn't understand loss, could never grasp the pain of losing someone you loved. But now, as he watched him speak softly to the boy, Jacob saw something else, a shared understanding of grief, a humility that felt real. It was as if the moment stirred something long dormant in him. The weight he had carried of guilt, of regret, of endless nights haunted by the faces of his fallen squad began to shift. For the first time in years, Jacob allowed himself to think about his own son, the boy he had walked away from, the family he had abandoned in the wake of his return. He wondered if it was too late to fix what he had broken. The thought stung, as sharp and sudden as the explosion that had shattered his life all those years ago. He had left his son without explanation, assuming it was for the best, believing that his presence would only poison the family he loved. But now, as he watched the boy with Trump, Jacob realized that perhaps leaving had been his greatest failure, not his survival. Maybe the hardest thing wasn't dying, it was living with the choice to walk away. For the first time, Jacob allowed himself to wonder, was there still time to mend what had been broken? Could he face the life he had abandoned and try to piece it back together? The thought both terrified him and ignited something inside him, a spark of hope he hadn't felt in years. But as the crowd dispersed and Trump made his way back to the motorcade, Jacob's thoughts were interrupted by a familiar face, a man from his past. The figure emerged from the shadows, walking toward Jacob with a limp. It was Sergeant Danvers, a fellow Marine from his squad, presumed dead in the same explosion that had killed the others. Jacob's heart raced, disbelief flooding through him. "You're supposed to be," he started, his voice hoarse. "Dead," Danvers said with a crooked grin. "Yeah, I know. They told me the same thing. But I survived, just like you." His grin faded, replaced by a hard edge. "Except I didn't run. I didn't hide in a cemetery." Jacob's chest tightened, anger flaring up. "I didn't run. I stayed with the dead, because that's all I had left." Danvers stepped closer, his voice low and cold. "You chose this. You could have gone back to your family, but you didn't. You let guilt eat you alive, Jacob. And for what? To dig graves." Jacob felt the mix of shame and fury rise in him. "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly." Danvers cut him off, his voice sharp. "I lost my leg, and I still found a way to keep going. You lost your spirit." The words stung, cutting deeper than Jacob had expected. He stood there, fists clenched at his sides, unaware of what to say or even how to process what Danvers had thrown at him. All these years he had believed that the cemetery was where he belonged, where he could atone for surviving. But now, The cracks in that belief were starting to show, and Danvers' words had broken through the fragile remnants of his justification. Danvers, with his limp and hardened expression, turned to walk away but stopped just before disappearing into the growing shadows of the cemetery. He glanced back over his shoulder, his voice low and steady, each word laced with undeniable truth. "If you want redemption, you're not going to find it among the dead, Jacob. You need to go back to the living." Jacob flinched, his breath catching in his throat. Danvers' words hit him with the force of a blow he hadn't seen coming. He had spent so many years believing that his only path to redemption was through honouring the fallen, tending to their graves, keeping their memories alive in the silence of Arlington. It was his penance, his way of making peace with the ghosts of his squad. But now, standing there, he realized that maybe he had been avoiding something far harder, something that couldn't be found among the neat rows of headstones. Going back to the living, the idea was foreign to him. The living meant facing everything he had run from: the pain, the shame, and the family he had abandoned. The thought of returning to his wife and son felt insurmountable, like crossing a battlefield with no armor. How could he look them in the eye after all these years? How could he explain the emptiness that had consumed him, that had led him to bury himself here instead of facing the life he had left behind? The distant murmur of the crowd brought Jacob back to the moment. He looked up, and there, not far from where he stood, Donald Trump was still interacting with families. The 6-year-old boy clutched the American flag in honor of his father, his small hands trembling. His mother wiped her tears, but the child's gaze remained fixed on the medal he had just been bestowed on his dad's behalf, as if it was a tangible piece of his legacy, something to hold on to in the face of unimaginable loss. Trump, usually the center of attention, seemed different at that moment. He wasn't surrounded by cameras or reporters, just the families of fallen soldiers. His larger-than-life persona was gone, replaced by something quieter, more human. Jacob had never seen this side of the man, and it shook him to his core. He stepped forward, hesitantly at first, his boots crunching against the gravel. For years he had stayed in the shadows, content to let the world pass him by. But now something inside him urged him to move, to step out into the light. He didn't know what he would say or if anyone would even notice him, but he knew this was the moment. As he approached the group, Trump looked up, locking eyes with Jacob. There was a flicker of recognition, perhaps from the years Jacob had spent in the background of these events, maintaining the graves that surrounded them. But there was something else in Trump's gaze, something that acknowledged the weight Jacob carried without a word. The president extended his hand. Jacob hesitated, staring at the outstretched hand for a moment that felt like an eternity. Chills ran down his spine. Then, slowly he reached out and shook it. The handshake wasn't just a formality, it was a recognition of something deeper, an unspoken understanding of loss, survival, and the burdens both men carried. "You've done good work here," Trump said quietly, his voice low, the usual bravado absent. Jacob nodded, swallowing hard. "That's all I've known how to do." Trump's eyes softened, and for a moment there was silence between them. Then, with a slight nod, Trump added, "Sometimes it's not about what you've done, it's about what you'll do next." Jacob stood there, the weight of the words hanging in the air between them. He hadn't expected wisdom from the president, but in that brief exchange he found something he hadn't known he needed permission to let go, to move forward. As Trump turned back to the families, Jacob felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. The boy with the medal looked up at him, offering a small, timid smile. Jacob smiled back, feeling a connection to the child in a way he hadn't felt in years. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe there was still a chance to rebuild what he had broken. For the first time in as long as he could remember, Jacob allowed himself to think about the future, not the graves he would tend tomorrow or the lives he had failed to save, but the life he might still have. His son was out there, and so was the woman he had loved and left behind. With one last glance at the boy, Jacob turned and walked away from the cemetery, his steps lighter than they had been in years. The dead would always have a place in his heart, but it was time to go back to the living. And for the first time, he felt ready. Do you believe veterans need more help than they get when they come home? What would you do if you came across Trump on a personal level? Share your ideas in the comments section below. Thank you for watching this video. We'll see you in the next one.